The following program is a presentation of Grace Communion International and Grace Communion Seminary and is made possible by generous donations from viewers like you. On this episode of You're Included, theologian Dr. Andrew Root explains how relational youth ministry arises from a place of sharing and not from patterns of influence. Our host is Dr. J. Michael Fizel.
Thanks for being with us. You wrote an article called A Call to See and Be Near, and in it you said, too often relational youth ministry avoids suffering and therefore lacks the boldness and bravery to enter into the full humanity of adolescence. What does it look like to enter into the full humanity of adolescence?
Actually, that article is an excerpt from the book Relationships Unfiltered, so that's the shameless plug. I think it has two broad forms that it exists in. I mean, I'm often asked, what will this look like? How do I do this? And I'm always very uncomfortable to say too much because I want to remind everyone that context always matters and that your contextual location will set the terms for how you do things. And I'm no expert to tell anyone in their own context, which they know much better than I do, how to do something. I see my job as only presenting some ideas that might help people think about what they're doing. But I think there's two broad points that maybe give some of this some shape. And one is, I think our objective is to correspond to reality with young people. Or another way to say that is to kind of take Luther's statement in the Heidelberg Disputation, where he says one of the points of the Christian, one of the objectives of the Christian, is to call a thing what it is. And I think relational ministry has this element to it, that part of the heart of it is to call a thing what it is, to see a young person's reality and be able to speak and call it what it is, to say this is incredibly difficult, or you're really good at this. Maybe the best analogy or story that goes along with this comes from the British comedy About a Boy. It's this movie about two individuals, Will, who is this young adult, maybe in his late 30s, who's played by Hugh Grant, and then there's this junior high age boy named Marcus. And Marcus is this very odd, eccentric kid who's been raised by his British hippie mother. And Will, played by Hugh Grant, is this incredibly self-centered dude. His whole life is really about pleasing himself. And he actually meets Marcus when he's out on a date with one of Marcus's mother's friends, because Marcus's mother is feeling blue. And when they return to Marcus's flat, they realize that his mother has actually attempted to commit suicide. And she's laying on the floor and had vomited. And luckily she doesn't die. They get her to the hospital. But for some reason, Marcus decides that he's going to start showing up at Will's apartment. So he shows up the first day, and of course, Will is not happy to see Marcus, but Marcus wants to come in. And slowly, day after day, Marcus starts showing up at Will's apartment. And they spend about a half an hour, 45 minutes together watching a British game show, and then Marcus leaves. But he keeps showing up. And of course, the scene starts where Will's very reluctant to have Marcus come into his house until days later, in this kind of montage way they're telling the story, he's opening the door and expecting Marcus to show up. Well, as the scene unfolds, you hear kind of inside of Marcus's head. He says, after a while, Will felt like he had to ask me serious questions. I know all he wanted to do was watch Xena Princess Warrior, but he decided he had to ask me a serious question. So Will turns to Marcus and says, so how are things going at home then? And Marcus kind of stoically says, oh, fine. Thanks for asking. And then he says, well, is that still bothering you then? Referring to his mother. And then we hear inside Marcus's head, and Marcus says, still bothering me. That's why I come here every day after school instead of going home. And then we hear outside of his head, audibly, he says, a bit, when I think about it. And then Will turns to him, this self-centered guy who's invited this kid into his life, turns to him, and in this great compassion and empathy, he looks at him and then shakes his head and swears. He says the F word and just shakes his head. And then you hear again, as Marcus is leaving the flat, you hear him say inside his head, he says, I don't know why Will swore like that, but it made me feel good. It made me feel like I wasn't so pathetic for getting so scared. And I think part of faithful relational ministry that's play sharing is being able to be close enough to kids to say, that's a terrible thing. And being able to call a thing what it is. And I think it's a way that we really join in relationship, is to be able to call a thing what it is. But I think there's a second element to it as well, is we not only have to call a thing what it is and be able to say, bleeping hell, this is hard, but also be able to say, nevertheless, even in the dark shadow of this reality, the tomb is empty. One day when my wife is about a couple springs back, my wife's grandfather had passed away. And it was right on a Sunday morning as my wife was getting ready to go to church, and we had known that he was fading and that he would die soon, but we got a call on a Sunday morning that he had actually passed away. So my wife knew about this, so she was fairly stoic about it, and so she grabbed our son and got him in the car and headed off to church. But about halfway to church, it kind of hit her that he was gone and that she wouldn't see her grandfather again. So she kind of started to tear up and cry in the front seat, and our son was behind her in his car seat. And after a while, she noticed in the rearview mirror that he was looking at her, and so she said, "Owen, I'm really sorry that I'm crying. I'm sad." And he said, "Well, why?" And of course, at this time, he was about 2, maybe 3 years old, probably 3 years old. And of course, why would just spill from his lips upon any question he would ask. But this why seemed to have real significance to it. And she said, "Well, I'm sad because my grandpa died, and I'm not going to be able to see him again." And they kept on driving, and as they got off the freeway, he was very quiet and very pensive, kind of looking out the window. And then as they got to the first light, he said, "But Mommy, I have a secret." She said, "Well, what's the secret?" "The secret is that someday Jesus is coming back, and you and your grandpa will be together again. Jesus is coming back, and death will be no more." And I think there's something between these two things of being able to say, bleeping hell and I have a secret, is where we live out the faithfulness of relational ministry. We're in connection with young people. We call a thing what it is. This must be incredibly hard, to have to deal with not having any friends, or feeling like these rumors are destroying your life, or to wonder if your parents' marriage is going to make it, or just to have your dreams about what you want for yourself to find them implode when your test scores come back, or when you get cut from a team. To be able to say, this is incredibly difficult, but also to whisper. And whisper it as a secret. And I don't mean it's a secret where we want to keep it from people, but it's a secret in the sense that it's so beautiful and so profound and so rich. This idea that God is overcoming death with life, that it's so wonderful, that it shakes the very foundations of the universe, that we have to whisper it because it connects with the core of our humanity so much. So I think it's living between these two things, being able to say, calling a thing what it is, and I have a secret. Nevertheless, the tomb is empty. And I think living out of those two inclinations, those two stances, is a way that we faithfully live with and for young people, and really live with and for each other.
So what is it about us as adults that makes us feel such an urge to attempt to control what an adolescent thinks by what we say and how we say it? It's as though we want to give an impression of invulnerability on our part. Mm-hmm. And we want to, we think we can control what a child or a kid will think or be by telling them the thing that we want them to do or the thing that we want them to think from some kind of imperial bench, looking down on them to tell them how it really is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's out of fear. That I think that we fear that if we're not in control, then we don't make a good case for the gospel, which I actually think is counter to the biblical picture we receive from Jesus, particularly about what the gospel is, which it always comes in weak, broken forms. You know, it's like a mustard seed, or it's like a woman who sweeps her whole house looking for a coin, or it's like a father who rushes out, who sees his son on the horizon and rushes out and throws off his cloak to embrace his lost son. I mean, it's about all these broken forms. And we tend to think that and I think this is just the lens we've been given in our cultural context that might makes right, or powerfulness is what sells. Maybe it's just part of the consumer culture that we exist in, the material culture we exist in. But I really think there's something counter to that in the gospel, which is that God comes to us in frail and weak ways, in a baby born in a manger to a 15-year-old girl who's existing under the thumb of Roman rule. I mean, all these, and then this God chooses in the person of Jesus Christ to show us the full picture of who this God is by going to a cross outside the city to be neglected and destroyed by death. I mean, I think we tend to want to control young people because we fear that if we show weakness, then what will become of them? And they'll for surely deny the faith or not have a place for the church in their lives unless we give it a nice spin and we make it look shiny and good, as opposed to really talking about the fact that Christianity is this commitment to a God who comes to us in the frail humanity of Jesus Christ, that goes through death for the sake of life. There's something very unique about that narrative in Christianity that should change the way we actually interact with the world and engage the world. But I think the reason we have such a hard time doing it is that we fear that weakness will lead them away from where we desire for them to go. But the truth is, at the very core of who we are, what we want more than anything is to be with them. That's what we want more from our children. And I think that's what we're all yearning for, is to be with and have someone be for us. But I think we get stuck in thinking that that we all have to make something of ourselves. So how can young people make something of themselves if we show ourselves as vulnerable?
It seems like in our desire to push them that we actually harm the relationship. Our efforts to influence actually drives them away from us instead of drawing them in, and we lose the influence we want through the effort to exercise the influence.
Yeah, I tell my students all the time, you cannot get a relationship through judgment. I mean, there's very few people who will ever have a friendship when someone comes up and says, I just wanted to tell you, you are a very ugly person, or you dress like you're from 3 decades earlier, or, your whole disposition repulses me. Usually a relationship does not start very well that way. But the truth is, once you have a relationship, it does demand judgment, or does demand certain assertions. If my wife wouldn't love me unless she said things to me like, because I love you, I have to tell you, do you know you talk more than you listen? Or when you say things like that, it really is belittling to me. The very fabric of our relationship is contingent on her saying those things to me. It deepens our relationship. But I think too often adults, and maybe it's this generation gap that you had mentioned in an earlier session, that we come into this relationship saying these kids need to be made right. And instead of seeing them for who they are and their humanity and joining in relationship, and then there are things that need to be said. Like, you can't do these things, or these things will hurt you. We usually tend to lead off with the judgment, and we may not intend to, but it's often interpreted that way. And so I don't want to say that relationships mean we never say anything to kids, like, you need to finish high school, or, you need to think about showering before you go to a job interview. I mean, those are all valuable things that we would want our friends to say to us. But the key is, are they our friend, or is there a relationship there of love and mutuality and connection that actually invites us to share things and to share life this way? I think part of the issue often in the way relationships function, at least in my own experience, is that there has to be kind of this equal pace at going at a depth. So, I mean, this happened to me in college all the time. This is why my dating record in college was so poor, because I would go out with a date with a young woman, and then I would want to take the relationship deeper than she would want to, and all of a sudden the relationship was over because I had forced a level of intimacy or connection that she wasn't ready for, and no relationship can live under those strictures. But where relationships function the best is where people kind of equally go at a level and it's mutual. And I think so often in youth ministry we meet kids and then we try to get them deep right away, instead of really sharing in their lives and trusting that in being together and being with each other, and sharing the importance of the gospel in my own life, that there's a level of shared life that will bring us to a deeper level. But too often we think it's our job to get them here and to drive the relationship deeper. And I think there's so many kids that just say, my gosh, these people are weird, or this is just really uncomfortable, or they don't see me, they see where I need to go. So I think that's an important element.
Isn't that partly a function of having a number of kids assigned to you, as it were? So the kids become a job, a project, and you have to get through so many, and you've got a place where you want them to be, as it were. You want them to be moral, and you want them to make a commitment. And so there isn't like you've got the patience to, or the time to invest in letting each one develop into the relationship that will, in effect, bring them where they need to be.
Yeah. This gets back to the specialization thing we talked about earlier as well, is that I don't think that one paid youth worker and her 2 or 3 volunteers can actually be play sharers with 35 kids in their youth group. I think it's impossible. I mean, if we really are about sharing in the yearning and brokenness, the joy and the suffering of young people, then, and if it's going to be both open and closed, then you can't do this with 20 kids, and if it's just you or maybe one other person. So this really is a congregational approach. And I think you're exactly right that one of the reasons that we tend to default towards influencing them towards some end is because we think, my gosh, I have 15 kids here, and they all seem to need more time. And it's even worse because once one class graduates, there's another class going in, and it just can feel like this incredible burden. And that's why I don't really think there's such a thing as an incarnational or a fully relational youth worker, but there's communities that are incarnational. And there may be a few people who actually do some of that action, but it takes a congregation. I really think that we can only be place sharers with 3 or 4 kids at the most. And the truth is that one paid youth worker cannot be a place sharer with, unless your youth group is 3 or 4 kids, cannot do that. But I think every congregation has the resources in its own life to have adults be place sharers with the young people that they have, and even more young people they have in their community. So it really becomes about a congregation and not a youth ministry, or even worse, a youth worker. But that does mean that the youth worker, the paid youth worker, has to change the way she thinks about herself. That it's no longer your job to be the pastor to these kids, but you are a pastor to this whole congregation that advocates for these kids. So that means you have to do certain work to accrue relational capital with the young people in the youth group, but also the adults. And usually when we interview youth workers, we want to know, do the kids like him or her? Do they like this person? And I think that's important, but it's just as important that other adults in the congregation are willing to be led by this person, or to enter into a partnership of ministry with this person. And if this person's really good with the younger populations of people, but all the other people in the congregation, the older people, don't trust this person, then I think that their ministry becomes only about them, and will always default then into patterns of influence instead of patterns of place sharing, and will tend to live out of more of our knee-jerk need than out of this theological commitment to a God who comes to us in Jesus Christ, in this Trinitarian element that we've been trying to point to.
Isn't that true across the board in every ministry of the church, that it becomes real in its context within the whole congregation, as opposed to a segmented, narrow approach to just meet the needs, as it were, the perceived needs of a seniors ministry, or a young adults ministry, or a singles ministry, when everyone can be part of everything, it works a lot better.
Yeah. Yeah, and the truth of the matter is, and this always makes my students very uncomfortable, but youth ministry doesn't really exist in the sense that it's not a biblical theme, it's not a theological commitment. It's a reality that's determined by the way our society is structured. As soon as the high school doesn't exist anymore and MTV doesn't exist, there will be really no reason for youth ministry. Youth ministry exists because we put over 90% of people in their teen years in a government institution and have them spend most of their days in a peer-driven institution, and then there's a whole marketing infrastructure that sells things to them and needs niche markets. So, 150, 200 years ago, there's no such thing as youth ministry. I mean, your young people were near you. But youth ministry exists because of the way culture has constructed itself. And so it doesn't exist as a thing. And too often we've fallen into the trap of seeing it as this thing, and then we perpetuate certain activities and actions that we think a youth worker would do or a youth ministry should do. But the truth of the matter is it isn't a thing. Ministry really is human person to human person through the humanity of God in Jesus Christ. And I think we fall into that trap that youth ministry is this particular thing. And then we give all sorts of different bubbles of this, then like you said, there's a senior ministry and there's a young adult ministry and there's the mothers with 3 kids who like bubblegum ministry or something. I mean, you can segment this into all sorts of different groups. And I think it does tend to be problematic and lead us away from this core commitment that this is about a community of faith who seeks God in the frailty of our humanity.
In your article, A New Generation Demands New Categories for Theology and Ministry, you wrote, as it has been documented, most don't hate or despise the church, they just don't care. And they don't care, I'm arguing, because the categories that they use to make meaning are not the categories we are using to do theology and ministry. Our categories no longer match their reality, no longer have congruence with their habits. We must do theology and ministry in new categories if we hope it will mean anything to a younger generation. Mm-hmm. What are these categories that they have that we're not sharing?
Yeah, in that article that you can find online, I look at this pop artist, Lily Allen, and
Yes.
in this song she has called The Fear. And she says some very interesting things in it, where she just basically discards these categories that the church and theology have tended to live in, which is right and wrong, and connected to that saint and sinner. And she actually has this very provocative line in the song where she says, I'm not a saint and I'm not a sinner, but all is cool as long as I'm getting thinner. Which shows that she's not going to live in these old, at least the way I interpret it, she's not going to live in these old categories. But that there's something else she's trying to find meaning and purpose in. And my argument, as you read, is that these categories have changed. In that we tend to, instead of young people trying to figure out, am I good or am I bad, they recognize, especially in a postmodern context, that that's really a hard thing to define, that you can exist in one of those things. But I think the new category that we haven't yet dwelt enough on, and she enters into this in her chorus, is that she asks this question, am I real? Is there anything real here? And it's really a question of ontology. Do I have any being? And is there anything solid that I exist in? And her fear isn't that she's bad or that she's a sinner, it's that she doesn't exist at all. And I think there's this element of the early Reformation theology that goes back really to Luther, which is really dwelling on these questions of the ontological significance of Jesus Christ for us. So it's asked these huge questions of where does God encounter us and how does God encounter us? And for Luther, and Calvin picks this up in his own way, but it's really the God on the cross. That's where God encounters us. So Luther would always love to use this phrase that Moltmann picked up for his book in the late 60s, early 70s called The Crucified God. So Luther wanted us to recognize that it's God on the cross who's being crucified, that God in God's self is going through death. And Moltmann would push this in his work to talk about how the Trinity goes through death on the cross, that the Son is overtaken in and it experiences negation, and the father understands what it's like to have the father's heart ripped out from the father as he loses the one he loves to the abyss of death. And my argument in this article is that the church hasn't dwelt enough in actually formulated practices of ministry that reflect on this question of, am I real? How do I navigate life in a way that makes my existence feel like it stands on anything solid at all, because I feel like things are slipping away. So part of my argument is that it's not that young people don't like the church or don't think there's any value in it. They just simply don't think it has anything meaningful to say. It's still talking about being right or being wrong. It's still talking about saint and sinner categories instead of talking about them through this ontological framework, which is when the saint and sinner dynamic becomes much more significant, that we're both saint and sinner simultaneously, that we're caught between these two realities, and that God in Jesus Christ enters into despair and death so that we're never alone in it again, and so that God turns it so that from death comes life.
So what does that mean for a congregation's approach to young people in the church and those they want to reach?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it means ultimately being people that are willing to confront and articulate those places in our life that we find to be places of yearning and brokenness, that our preaching and our teaching and our life together should actually mean something, and it should mean something up against those raw places of our life. I think part of the issue, again, why young people, why they have these benign relationships with the church, is simply because they don't think it means anything. It doesn't matter to them. And so I think the place for us to start is to be willing to dwell in our own lives at those places of yearning and of brokenness, and try to construct theology around those.
So that gets back to what we were talking about earlier, that of sharing the place, and learning how to listen to the story and to share stories, our story with young people.
Yeah.
You've been watching You're Included, a production of Grace Communion International.